Good day, all, and welcome to the second of the week's lectures on medieval Islamic medicine. Thus far, we've spent a lot of time talking about the retrospectoscope, about what it is, and about its benefits and limits as a conceptual tool for doing history of medicine. One of the reasons we're paying attention to the subject of retrospective diagnosis this week is that, as we've seen, it helps us understand some of the controversial claims that have been made about the supposed modernity of medieval Muslim medical thought and practice. Armed with a knowledge of the retrospectoscope, we can more carefully assess statements such as, Avicenna was a pioneer of psychophysiology, or Avicenna's books read like a modern course in population biology. Do declarations such as these do violence to the past? Does the imposition of modern concepts on the work of pre-modern doctors like Avicenna detract from our ability to understand what he and his contemporaries were actually doing? Would it be better to work with the concepts and categories that medieval Muslims themselves were working with? Or is it okay to interpret the past in terms of the present? How serious of a sin is presentism, really? Today, we're going to encounter another facet of medieval Islamic medicine that connects with this debate over presentism, and that is hospitals. The hospital was one of the key features of the medieval Islamic medical marketplace. The first of these emerged in modern-day Iraq during the late 8th and early 9th century, and from the 10th century onward, they started popping up in cities all across the Muslim world, including places like Damascus, Cairo, Jerusalem, and Baghdad. By the 11th century, Baghdad was home to 12 different hospitals, and altogether, these institutions were capable of caring for the city's population, which was around 400,000, at a rate of roughly 0.7 beds per 1,000 inhabitants. By modern-day standards, this is actually a fairly good carrying capacity. It compares favorably with 21st century Pakistan, for example. And quantity was not the only impressive thing about medieval Islamic hospitals. Within these facilities, one found a variety of medical specialists, including general practitioners, oculists, pharmacists, and surgeons. Often, specific areas of the hospital were reserved for particular conditions, for example, gastrointestinal complaints, eye ailments, fevers, and rheumatism. And in addition to serving as a center of medical treatment, medieval Islamic hospitals also functioned as teaching sites. That is, as places where established physicians would train their students. Indeed, some of the best doctors of the era worked in hospitals, and while there, they produced some really cutting-edge research. On account of these things, many commentators, including some prominent academics, have made the argument that today's hospitals have, as one piece puts it, Islamic roots. One of the more influential advocates of this view is the historian Michael Doles, who in a 1987 article discussed what he termed the apparent modernity of the medieval Islamic hospital. According to Doles, these institutions were far more advanced than their counterparts in the Christian East. What made them modern, more than anything else, was, as Doles says, their relatively secular orientation. While hospitals in the lands of Byzantine Christendom were frequently run by religious leaders, this was not the case in the lands of Islam. What this meant was that hospital physicians were relatively free to develop a professional institution beyond the constraints of a seminary infirmary. Doles credited medieval Islamic civilization with creating a new era of professional expertise within medicine. As with other aspects of medieval Islamic medicine, this interpretation has provoked controversy. One of the most recent accounts of the early history of Islamic hospitals comes from Ahmed Ragab, an associate professor in the history of science at Harvard University, who, in 2016, published a book called The Medieval Islamic Hospital: Medicine, Religion, and Charity. Ragab's book is highly critical of previous scholarship on this subject and accuses historians like Michael Doles of using the retrospectoscope. Finding fault with studies that trace the origins of the modern hospital back to the golden age of Islam, Ragab refuses to draw a straight line from the past to the present. He rejects ahistorical methodologies that privilege modern understandings over pre-modern ones. Instead of asking how quote-unquote developed medieval Islamic hospitals were, or whether or not these facilities should even be called hospitals, he situates them within the context of the times. One of the most powerful ways Ragab does this can be seen in his choice of terms. Noting that the term hospital is never used in primary source materials, Ragab calls these institutions by their medieval names, Bimaristans. By the way, so you know, Bimaristan is a Persian word derived from bimar, which means a sick or ill person, and stan, which means a location or a place. His argument, basically, is that contrary to what other historians have said, the medieval Bimaristan was not simply the forerunner of the modern hospital. Instead of being totally secular institutions that were concerned solely with medical care, education, and scientific research, they were, as the subtitle of his book implies, simultaneously sites of medicine, religion, and charity. In what follows, I'd like to offer you a bit of a guided tour of Ragab's book so we can see how he tries to advance this argument. Over the course of the book's 7 chapters, Ragab takes readers on an incredibly detailed journey through the Bimaristans of Egypt and the Levant from the 10th through the 14th centuries. Focusing on cities such as Damascus, Cairo, and Jerusalem, he addresses a number of pertinent questions about these institutions, including: why were they built? Who sponsored their construction and paid for their operations? Where were they located? What kinds of people received care within them? What kinds of physicians worked within them, and what kind of work did they do? And what was their ultimate purpose? As we examine his responses to these questions, I'd like us to think about how effectively his evidence refutes the claims of Doles and others who trace the roots of contemporary hospitals back to the pre-modern lands of Islam. As such, our questions for today, as you can see on the screen. The world of Islam was not the first to boast institutions of collective medical care. Within the Middle East, the first of these, which were known as xenodokion, literally places for strangers, or in other words, inns or guest houses, emerged in the middle of the 4th century. During the next 2 centuries, Byzantine leaders erected a variety of these, which were aimed largely at caring for travelers, the sick, the weak, and foreigners. None of these facilities were hospitals in the modern sense, as they did not differentiate between different kinds of patients: travelers, pilgrims, the poor, the sick, etc. When Muslim armies conquered the Middle East beginning in the 7th century, they inherited many of the pre-existing traditions and institutions of the Byzantines. This included xenodokion, the presence of which inspired some of the first Bimaristans. The earliest known example of this is the al-Bimaristan al-Tuluni, which was built by Ahmad ibn Tulun, who ruled in the late 9th century in Egypt. Ibn Tulun's Bimaristan was built in Ol Fustat, or Old Cairo, and, interestingly, was located right next to a new mosque he had constructed in the city. The Bimaristan cost 60,000 dinars to build and was evidently quite impressive. One observer reported that Ibn Tulun himself inspected it every Friday to ensure that patients were receiving quality care. This observer went on to write that, quote, Ibn Tulun's piety was evident with great enthusiasm and proper intentions. He bought for the Bimaristan precious revenues, some of which would suffice for all its needs, should God protect whoever is administering them. As both this passage and the Bimaristan's location indicate, this site had a highly religious significance. It was meant to signify Ibn Tulun's piety and his devotion to God. Instead of serving secular ends, this hospital ultimately served pietistic ones. Ibn Tulun's Bimaristan was not unique. Throughout the lands of medieval Islam, these facilities were often constructed for reasons that had to do with something more than just the pursuit of scientific knowledge and the delivery of state-of-the-art medical care. Often, Muslim rulers built Bimaristans in tandem with other kinds of buildings, including madrasas, mosques, palaces, and hippodromes for the training of soldiers, all in an effort to legitimize their control over a recently conquered area. Another example of this can be seen in the case of Nur al-Din Zanki, one of the most significant political actors of the 12th century. Over the course of his career, Nur al-Din gradually brought much of the Levant under Islamic rule, and in his principal cities, Aleppo and Damascus, he established madrasas, houses of justice, and Bimaristans. Again, the location of these sites is telling. In Damascus, Nur al-Din's Bimaristan was located near the Umayyad Congregational Mosque and his own house of justice. The Damascus hospital is also interesting from an architectural standpoint. One of the inscriptions on the facade of the building reads as follows: "This Bimaristan, whose completion was ordered, not for the purpose of immortality, but for the purpose of respite for the duration of one's reckoned fate, and preordained and predestined life, by the needy to God in his bountiful mercy, our Lord, the just, the scholar, the knower, the ascetic, the holy warrior, Nur al-Din, the pillar of Islam and Muslims." As the inscription makes clear, medical practice at this hospital was understood not to defy God's will by seeking immortality or escaping death, but simply to serve as a conduit wherein one's predestined fate might be lived out. Some of the most impressive hospitals in medieval Islam were built by al-Mansur Qalawun. Coming to power in 1279, Qalawun was the 7th sultan of the Mamluks, and his reign marked the end of Egypt's rule by the Ayyubids. The first 5 years of his reign were marked by intense political infighting and a great deal of palace intrigue. While sorting this out, Qalawun embarked on a program of construction and architectural patronage. His most famous building project was a massive Bimaristan Madrasa mausoleum complex. Designed to solidify his legitimacy, the Bimaristan in particular served to indicate the new sultan's power and piety. The hospital had an enormous budget, and in terms of spending priorities, Qalawun focused first and foremost on making patients comfortable and providing for their daily subsistence needs. Among the hospital's amenities were iron and wooden beds, quilts stuffed with cotton, expensive oil lamps, ceramic drinking glasses, and separate food bowls for every patient. Meals consisted of soup, rice, chicken, and other meats. Cheap and common foods like bread and fish were apparently not served. As this indicates, life within the hospital was designed to be quite luxurious for patients. In contrast with this, relatively little money was set aside for paying physicians. The doctors who worked at Qalawun's hospital had fairly low salaries, and few of them achieved any prestige in their lifetimes. Okay, so that brings us to the end of our journey through Ragab's book. Now that you've had a chance to learn about 3 of the different Bimaristans he discusses, I'm wondering what you make of his claims. Do you think his research helps us understand why we shouldn't trace the origins of modern-day hospital care back to medieval Islamic medicine? Does he effectively undermine the argument that the roots of contemporary hospital practice date back to this time? I'm very interested in your thoughts on these things, so once you've had a chance to mull them over, please head over to our discussion forum and share them with your classmates. I look forward to continuing the conversation with you there.